Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Don Winslow writes some of the most entertaining fiction around, period. At the same time, he brings to light so much within that fiction that's based on fact, with Esquire magazine opining of this exceptional skill set that you should try to get your hands on everything he's written because he's one of the best thriller writers on the planet, spotlighting the worldwide bestseller The Power of the Dog as an epic gritty south of the border godfather for our time. So cinematic on the page that Entertainment Weekly recently reported Don Winslow's epic Cartel trilogy is headed to TV, with FX purchasing the rights to all three of the author's harrowing novels about life, death, and loyalty in the crossfire of the international drug war. FX Network CEO John Landgraf commented that nothing excites the team at FX more than the daunting challenge of helping great creators make a television show as ambitious and good as the epically acclaimed books on which it will be based. It's one of the great crime epics of all time. While The Border, the final in the trilogy that was itself named a Best Book of the Year by the Washington Post, NPR, The Guardian, Booklist, and the Sunday Times, among many more, was one where Stephen King himself declared, "You can't ask for more emotionally moving entertainment," and what the New York Times further deemed to be a big, sprawling, ultimately stunning crime tableau. The Savages, which Oliver Stone would later direct as a blockbuster film based on Winslow's adaptation of his own work with Avatar screenwriter Shane Salerno, the LA Times would hail as a marvelous, adrenaline-juiced roller coaster of a novel, while its prequel, The Kings of Cool, sparked USA Today to warn readers that it's hard not to get hooked. People magazine's praise for The Death and Life of Bobby Z included its cinematic pacing, potent irony, and great escapes, recommending readers that you make this one of yours. Such accolades have followed Winslow throughout his entire bold, brave career on the page, through early works like the Neil Carey PI series that launched his career with A Cool Breeze on the Underground, The Trail to the Buddha's Mirror, Way Down on the High Lonely, A Long Walk Up the Waterslide, and While Drowning in the Desert, the winner of Frankie Machine, California Fire and Life, Looking for a Hero, the Daniel Boone duology with the Dawn Patrol and the Gentleman's Hour, the Fran Decker series with Missing in Germany, Satori, Vengeance in the Isle of Joy, along with the short story collection Broken and non-fiction work Looking for a Hero, co-written with Peter Maslowski. The Force took bookstore cash registers by storm, right along with readers in general, with Newsweek hailing it as part The Godfather, part The Wire. The Force is a Molotov cocktail of cops and corruption, where good guys are also bad guys, and police malfeasance isn't just about skimming money off drug busts. It's about the corruption that comes when trying to do the right thing. While the Village Voice added that in their esteemed opinion, the author brings an intoxicating combination of passion, authenticity, and grandeur to the crime thriller, expanding the very limits of the form, riveting, infuriating, and ultimately deeply moving. Most recently, he completed his final trilogy in a trailblazing career with City on Fire, which inspired the Wall Street Journal to reason that while the crime fiction canon has no shortage of memorable mob sagas by such masters as Puzo, Elroy, and Lehane, City on Fire, with its large cast of memorable characters and low-key allusions to classical literature, maintains Mr. Winslow's well-earned place in these ranks. While the sequel, City of Dreams, and the forthcoming City of Ruins wrap up one of the most original careers and catalogs in crime fiction. Don Winslow, it's an absolute honor. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. Before we turn the proverbial page back to childhood, we'd love to open with what may be a revelation for fans. That in part you learned how to write your style of crime fiction through jazz.
I think that I go back to Stravinsky saying music is the silence between the notes. You know, I think I really learned how to write crime fiction through jazz. There's the old saying that you're more familiar probably than I, that in the ending of a book should be simultaneously surprising yet inevitable. And I always thought that those were two contradictory terms that I could never reconcile. And then, because I've listened to jazz all my life, it's a major part of my life. And listening to the late, great Sonny Stitt, great saxophone player, play a tune called Everything Happens to Me. It's not important really, but toward the end, because I'm listening to it right on the computer, so I'm watching that bar go across, letting you know how much the song's left. And all of a sudden, man, it hit me like kaboom. I knew he had to end on a certain chord, or the story would be, the song would be unsatisfying. So inevitable. But the notes he used to get to that chord were surprising as hell. I went, damn, right? I know that I have to end the book on a certain chord, probably the chord I started it with, or it will be unsatisfying to the reader's ear. Because I originally wrote a different ending, by the way, to The Force, and then realized it and went back and rewrote it because it was the wrong chord. But the words and the events to get to that chord can be surprising. And that was, for me, the answer.
With a mother who's a librarian, is it safe to assume that you were encouraged to and surrounded by books as a child?
My mom was a librarian. Listen, my dad was a sailor, right? And he came off of Guadalcanal during World War II as a Marine. And I have no idea really what he experienced there. He didn't talk about it much. But what he said was that all he wanted to do was float around on the ocean, go to every zoo in Europe and read books, which he did. And then my mom, in this little town, as you mentioned, Perryville, which is, in the sort of little fishing villages in southern Rhode Island, was a librarian at this tiny old New England library. So my sister and I, always had access to books, and were always encouraged to read and allowed to read, by the way, anything we wanted to at any time. So really, that was it. Robert Ruark, R-U-A-R-K, who wrote a few books about Africa, which, when you look at them now, I think they're deeply flawed, in terms of their kind of understanding of Africa and the cultural prejudices that existed back in the 50s. But when I was a kid, I was like, wow, and my dad turned me on to those books. And that's, in fact, what led me to studying African history in college and going there and working there. Leon Uris, my dad turned me on to, read that early. This is going to sound really geeky, but I'm not going to lie to you. Shakespeare. I think I was maybe 6 or 7 when I first started to try to read Shakespeare, and I was that kid who would take a volume of Shakespeare out into the woods alone and sit and read, so there's so many. I didn't really hit crime fiction until probably my mid to late 20s. And then, of course, that became an absolute love.
Now, your path to the page was almost Indiana Jones-esque, except he's an archaeologist and you're a writer. But the travels you take all over the globe, beginning when you were studying African history at the University of Nebraska, and then when you went there firsthand, had to help open your eyes and expand your imagination as a writer, given all the adventures that you experienced there.
I was at Nebraska as a journalism major, which is why I went there. Great journalism school, still does. And then in my sophomore year, I took a class in African history. And that, coupled with having read those novels, and then, I don't know, there was a late night TV guy named Jack Parr back in the day. And the precursor to The Tonight Show when I was a little kid. And he used to go to Kenya and then come back with the equivalent of home movies. And I was just fascinated. So I had a chance to take this class, and then the university offered me entrance into this sort of special area studies program. So I moved into that. That sent me to South Africa during the bad old days of apartheid. And so, yeah, it's been a continuing kind of passion.
I'd say so, as thereafter, while earning your master's in military history within the region, you embarked on a photographic safari across Kenya, then led hiking expeditions across China. Please take viewers on a tour back through some of the highlights of these early years, writing and living abroad.
I was really trying to make a living, Nobody stamps your passport, as you know, to be a writer, And so, but I wanted to make a living doing stuff I enjoyed, doing something that'd be interesting. So I get a master's degree in military history, really in African military history, as a specialist in, and now everyone can take their nap. I was a specialist in the use of indigenous troops in counterinsurgency warfare. And was supposed to go into the State Department to pursue that, didn't. And a buddy of mine that I went to college with started a safari firm, which is still ongoing, to do photographic safaris. He needed a number two. It's funny, I was just emailing with him a little while ago. And so I did that because I had the languages. I had a few bush skills, I could get people in and out without necessarily getting them killed. So I did that. Then I was, I don't know, a year or so deep into that, and we had an opportunity to do hiking trips in China. And my buddy asked me, would you transfer to China for a while? So there I was up in the Oolong Panda Reserve and this crazy mountain in far western Sichuan in the Himalayan foothills, staying in Buddhist monasteries and climbing these mountains with people.
If that wasn't enough, you spent time in England directing plays at Oxford. Again, what a help that must have been to your novel writing to come, from any angle you could look at it from.
During that time, because I directed theater in college, another friend was starting this academic program for high school students at Oxford University in the summers, and they needed a theater teacher, someone to direct Shakespeare. And I instantly turned it down, right? I said, no, I'm very happy in Africa. Thank you. I'm just very happy chasing leopards around. It's all good. No. And then I met this guy, Jim Basker, who's a professor of literature at Barnard. And I was so taken by what he wanted to do, putting students together with great teachers in an inspirational place. And so I was just married, and that my wife and I got engaged in Kenya. And I'm on the phone to my wife, having said no, and all of a sudden saying, "Hey, babe, what would you think if we spent a month in Oxford before we go to Africa?" And she's the adventurous type and agreed. And so that started, 20 consecutive years of being there as well.
Somehow, amid all of that, you managed to carve out a second career as a private investigator. How much was P.I. Neil Carey, star of your first 5 novels, inspired, influenced, or otherwise molded, working in a very different Times Square in New York City circa the early 1980s?
I went to New York in the late 70s to become a writer, and was instantly, of course, a starving writer like everybody else. And I got a job as the assistant manager of a movie theater on the east side of New York in Manhattan. And in those days, I can't answer for it now, but in those days, movie theaters were just a circus of theft. I used to call it a glittering wall of larceny, because everyone was stealing from everybody at every level. The doormen and the ushers were stealing from the theater. The managers were stealing from the company. The company was stealing from the studios. The studios were, and I eventually got fired for having turned in a honest box office figures. But by that point, I didn't steal, by the way, as an Irish Catholic boy, too guilty to do it. But I knew how it was done. Another friend had just taken over a series of legit movie theaters in Times Square. There were such things even in 1980 in New York, prior to Mickey Mouse arriving in Times Square. And he needed somebody to go undercover to help expose the various theft rings. I spent 2 or 3 months doing that, and then stayed with this agency. I was doing a book event years ago. My wife was in the audience, and someone in the audience asked, "Are you Neil Carey?" And I was shaking my head like this, and I looked to the back of the room. My wife's doing this, saying, "Hell yes." So I try to deny it, because he's, petulant, whiny, difficult young guy. But I think I drew a lot of that experience because I left Times Square to go back to Nebraska to go to graduate school in history. And the culture shock was brutal. The first day I was in the library, somebody tipped over a book cart, and I dove to the floor, reaching for a gun that wasn't there anymore, because I was in Times Square at its absolute, worst time. You'd walk along the sidewalks or in the alleys, and it felt like seashells crunching under your feet, but they were actually crack files. But people kept, I was kept trying to get my degree, but work kept interfering because I, again, trying to make a living, and I would take cases, and so I think I drew Neil Carey from that, this guy who keeps trying to get his degree, but they keep sending him off to do other things. So that's certainly realistic. I was in London doing that during the hottest summer then at that point in time, and recorded English history. I was standing in the tube stop at Leicester Square at hot damn afternoon, and inexplicably this cool breeze just came up through the tunnel, and I thought, a cool breeze on the underground, but I didn't do anything about it, and I had that title in my mind for literally years, 8 or 9 years before I started to write the book.
So pulling not only a novel, but a full series out of that well of experience must have been as surreal as one of your trips into the African jungles once you were finally holding it in your hands.
I was in my late 30s, and 15 publishers turned that book down, including the one I'm with now, which I, like to remind them of occasionally. And we were living in a little village in Northwest Connecticut, your classic old New England village. No mail delivery, so you walked a mile down the hill and back up to get the mail at the post office, and the book arrived. And to this moment, I can remember holding it and thinking, wow, I never thought this was going to happen. I just never thought this was going to happen for me. And there it was.
Following its publication and nomination for the Seamus and Edgar Award for Best First Novel, you'd write a few more following A Cool Breeze on the Underground when you continued dispatching Carey on new fascinating cases to crack and the trail to the Brutus Mirror while drowning in the desert. Did you have most of these stories already down on paper while traveling around the world before the first book was published, so they were ready to go when the publisher wanted to follow up?
I did, because while everyone and their dog was turning down Cool Breeze, I was writing Buddha's Mirror, because I had to take the admittedly insane position that I was right and they were all wrong. Otherwise I couldn't have survived it, And so while the rejection letters were coming in, with regularity, I was saying, no, man, I'm going to type in, not only am I going to write another book, I'm going to write another book with the same character that you're all rejecting. And so when St. Martin's did give me a book deal, it was for 2 books, which were, Cool Breeze and Buddha's Mirror. Listen, I led this peripatetic life. And again, it was to make a living. It was not unusual for me in any given year to be living in Connecticut, California, England, China, and Africa. I mean, Cool Breeze was written on buses and planes and trains and in tents. I didn't have a choice, right? Wherever I could sit down for a few minutes and write, that I wrote. So then I'm off in China, and they send me to this mountain that Westerners had not been allowed in since 1949, since the revolution. And so you literally had children coming up and touching your face, because they'd never seen a Caucasian before. They had gangs of bandit monkeys that would attack you on this trail, big baboon-sized monkeys and things. And the only place to stay were in these monasteries. And so, which was fascinating. It was like Indiana Jones. I would go out in the evening onto these terraces, and there'd be, 100 monks doing kung fu in unison. And, they'd let me sit at the periphery, not join, but if I was quiet, I could just sit there. But, at night, they turn the generators off. And so all the lights go out, of course. And the Buddhists didn't believe in killing anything. And they would give you these, what I thought at first were mosquito nets, but the mesh was like that. And I thought, what the hell kind of mosquitoes do they have up here at 12,000 feet? It was for rats, because there was a temple that became known to me as the Bagua Hilton, Bagua being Chinese for rat. And so I'd take a hooded sweatshirt and pull it over my face and get in the sleeping bag and pull this net over, and then rats would be running over you. for most of the night. Having said that, though, it was a wonderful experience, man. I loved the people, and the terrain was crazy. And so, yeah, I thought, well, I'll bring Neil there. My original idea of the series was to take Neil all over the world. And then at the end of book 2, St. Martin's nixed that. And they said, no, he's got to stay in the United States.
Was The Death and Life of Bobby Z, which Newsweek raved packs a wallop of a semi-automatic weapon, and People magazine complimented for its cinematic pacing, potent irony, and great escapes, one of those cases where you encountered a real-life character, then you then based the novel that followed on?
I moved out to Cali, right? And I will never forget the exact day. I was in a nondescript hotel in Costa Mesa, California, and I was supposed to interview a witness, and he punked out on me. And all of a sudden I have a free day. Well, what am I going to do? I thought, well, I'll drive down this Pacific Coast highway. So I because I was inland, and I drive out to the coast, and it was like, bam, I fell in love. Absolutely fell in love. And I'm still in love. I've driven that damn PCH thousands of times, right? It's still exciting to me every time. So I drive down, and all of a sudden I'm in this town I've never been in, Laguna Beach, California. And I just like, this is so great. And so, my wife and kid and I, we lived in hotels for 3 years in various parts of Southern California while I was doing casework, and the books were not paying enough to pay the bills. And so we drive around a lot, and, I started to hang out in Laguna and do a little surfing in Laguna. And I was hanging out with surfers and kind of martial arts guys. And that, as you're ahead of me, you're nodding, leads you into a familiarity with marijuana people. And I, by the way, my only drug is coffee, and so, I began to know these guys and hang out and kind of get that humor. And I think that's what you're seeing, and so graciously commented about Bobby Z.
The Wall Street Journal would muse of another of your most real-feeling gangsters on the page, hitman Frankie Masciano, that, like his book's central figure, Mr. Winslow is good at what he does. Was it those mafia guys you grew up locally around back as a kid in New Hampshire that inspired him and the story that follows in The Winner of Frankie Machine?
I knew those guys, and when I was a kid. So, it was, that was a fun book to write. And I'm a historian, by training and by inclination. I love history. I read biographies, by the way, constantly. And so the research for it was so much fun. Looking into that local San Diego, South Orange County crime history, and then a little bit in Las Vegas. I had a great time learning about that stuff. I just finished writing a book called The Power of the Dog, a very heavy, kind of grim book about the narcotics trade. And I was exhausted emotionally, mentally. That book took me 6 years to research and write. And what I mostly wanted was to get away from that world, And then I got thinking, because by that time I moved to the San Diego area, and I fell in love with San Diego. And I got thinking, I want to write a mob novel, but I don't want to write an East Coast mob novel because it's been done and done so well. It didn't need any contribution from me. But I didn't feel that the West Coast mob novel per se, with all respect to James Ellroy, who, I also admire and respect, had not been done. And also I thought, I could maybe tell a big chunk of the history of Southern California crime, because all of the cases that Frankie goes through in the flashbacks as he's exploring his life are based on real cases. And I thought it would be fun to take a guy who's not that East Coast guy, right? He's a West Coast guy. And the West is traditionally, in folklore and literature, where people go to change or die, which I guess is change. And so I was trying to combine all of those elements. And then Frankie himself, I grew up in the East Coast, in Rhode Island, and with a very heavy mob presence there. You knew those guys. They were the guys who gave you dimes and quarters to buy comic books, and they threw parties, and you weren't involved in it, but they were always on the periphery. So Frankie, that older kind of mob guy, was a very familiar figure to me, you know, and in an odd kind of way, it was comforting after Power of the Dog, to write that character. And I think that there is, kind of a sleight of hand that a lot of us do. Block does it, Leonard does it, that you take a character that you should not like on an objective level and make him likable.
The Power of the Dog would mark the start of your eye-opening and at times eye-shutting series. In terms of all you exposed in the books about the drug wars at and beyond our borders in Mexico that people probably didn't want to see but needed to for the story to be fully effective in your Cartel series, where Publishers Weekly spotlighted your depth of research and unflagging attention to detail that give the story both heft and immediacy, and his staccato present tense prose shifts easily among wildly disparate settings and multiple points of view. Its complex plotting, well-drawn characters, and plenty of double-crossing make this a thinking person's narco thriller. Where did DEA agent Art Keller's journey first start in your imagination before readers embarked with him on this incredibly entangled cast that includes Nora Hayden, Father Juan Ocampo Parada, Sean Callahan and the Chimino mob family, drug lord Aiden Barrera and his brother Don Miguel Anglo Tio Barrera, Jimmy Picone, Sal Scacchi, Guerrero Mendez, Obop Ramos, Ernie Hidalgo, and so many others that proceed so powerfully on the page from here.
I had never had any interest whatsoever in that world, in the Mexican narcotic world. And then I'm usually up around 4:30 or 5 in the morning, so I like to be at work by 5:30. But the first thing that I do every day is I read 5 newspapers. I don't read every word, but I look at the headlines, and if there's articles, and then I read them. So one morning I get up, and there's an article in the San Diego Union Tribune about the massacre of 19 innocent women and children in a little town, El Sazal, not far from where we'd go for cheap weekends, right? Again, Mexico's just down the road here. And I was shocked. Now, mind you, this was 97. By the time I come to write the Cartel, 19 bodies in a day wouldn't make the paper. Right, that would be a low body count in 2006, 2007. But at that point, it was shocking, and I was shocked. And I started to do research, not thinking of writing a book, but just to satisfy my own curiosity and upset. And it's funny, I started reading philosophy books, started reading books with titles like The Problem of Evil and that kind of thing. And the answers were not there. So I started to read Mexican history and Latin American history, and then drug war history and all of that kind of thing. And then one day I was typing.
You really do give here what many have called the most comprehensive novelized history of the way this all really works on the ground, behind the scenes, in the tunnels, and at the highest levels of corrupted and criminal power in this book and series, and focusing in on writing from the antagonist point of view, as you do so convincingly here. What's your trick to pulling that off with, say, a truly evil pair of characters like the Barrera brothers, who will kill women and children even to maintain power over the drug trade and turn a profit?
I was an actor as a kid, and then directed theater for a long time. And I think I used actors' techniques, sort of the method, not really, but to get into it, to get inside the head. But yeah, there'd be weeks at a time when you're living in a Don Barrera's head, or you're living in the head of a 13-year-old hitman, or in the head of a 26-year-old female heroin addict, and you have to stay inside of that, I think, at least I do, in order to try to do it well and to do it realistically, which is what I owe to the reader. It's my job, right? That's what I'm supposed to do. That's what distinguishes us from journalists, right? Is that I have not only the opportunity, but I think the responsibility to bring the reader into that world and see it through the character's eyes. Unlike journalists, I'm allowed to make up dialogue and the emotional life of a character and the background of a character. I hasten to add, by the way, that in all three of those books, there's not one incident of violence that didn't actually happen in one way or another. It's all real. So then you're looking at like a character like a Don, who, and some of the others, who by any standard, objective standard, you would think that's a monster, right? But I can't, when I'm sitting down to type from that character's point of view, I can't be objective. That's not my job. My job is to be subjective. If I were to be objective, what you would end up with, I'm afraid, is this one-dimensional black silhouette on the moral white field, right, of my own morality. That's not good enough. And so I have to, when I'm writing those sequences, do my best to see the world through his eyes. Now, as an investigator, you know, I sat down with murderers, right? A lot of times my job to interview them. They always had a point of view. We might think of it as horrific and wrong and obscene, but they always had a point of view. It just always happened. So, sorry, my wrist is ringing. That's the job to do it. And then how do you do it? Well, the way is to try to find out as much about that person's life as you possibly can.
Rolling Stone magazine will crown your sequel, The Cartel, as the Game of Thrones of the Mexican drug wars, courtesy of a multi-part, intricately plotted, blood-soaked epic that tells the story of how America's unquenchable appetite for illegal drugs has brought chaos to our southern neighbors and darkened our own political and criminal culture. While Entertainment Weekly made the important and poignant point that although Winslow works in fiction, his narratives are fortified with details of actual bloodshed and brutality that perforates the boundaries of both US and Mexico, as well as the Central American nations caught up in the trafficking networks. And by now, after everything Art Keller and his co-stars went through in the first book, it's safe to say that for better or worse, there's almost a relationship of sorts that's developed here between Art and Eden Barrera that plays centrally into the second story and concludes quite dramatically in The Border, which National Public Radio correctly concluded is operatic and visceral and has stakes that hang lives and nations in the balance. Taken all together in its entirety as a full-sweeping, fictionalized tale rooted and grounded in very real tragedy. The Border becomes Shakespeare for our times.
Absolutely. A relationship between the two of them. And then I don't mean to be artsy fartsy about this, but in a way, a relationship between me and Keller and me and Adon, you know? Now, look, I never intended to write 3 books, right? When I finished Dog, I thought I was done, you know? In fact, I swore I wouldn't write another one. And did the same after The Cartel. Promised myself, promised my wife that I wouldn't go back to that world, and did. And so when I look at those 3 books, you know, I didn't have, as I did in this most recent trilogy, the idea of a trilogy and the idea of that overarching arc. But what I did have was reality, right? That when I came around to write I had a 157-page single-spaced document that was just a chronology of what happened in the drug war in Mexico during the era of the cartel, because I'm a big believer in chronology. And so then I had this freaking, like, all this stuff happened. How do you put it into a novel? And I thought, well, you have to take the significant events. Well, that begs the question, what's significant? So I made a decision that what is significant is something that caused the next significant event, right? You take Art Keller and you say, what events will he fit into organically? I didn't want to turn him into Zelig. You know what I mean? That, like, everywhere we go, oh, Art Keller shows up, which is why I invented some other characters, a journalist, Pablo Mora, who started out as a minor character, and then I loved him so much he became a major character. And so, but then I start seeing this inevitable climax occurring between Keller and Barrera, that it has to happen from a dramatic viewpoint, that there's no longer any avoiding it.
The New York Times would declare in the wake of the series' massive success that Don Winslow is to the Mexican drug wars what James Ellroy is to LA Noir. Did the original idea for The Savages, which the LA Times correctly called a marvelous adrenaline-juiced roller coaster of a novel, first come out of researching or writing the Cartel series?
No, here's why I'm laughing. I don't mean to be rude. My career had again kind of flatlined. Dog, when it first came out in the United States, went nowhere. It was a big hit in Europe, but here, now later on, after the Cartel, people here went back and bought it. But so my career's kind of flatlined. No one in the industry is terribly happy with me. And I'm sitting down one morning at my desk, and I'm pretty angry. And I type out the words that became the famous first chapter, the famous first, 2-word chapter of Savages. It was more of a memo to my editor. And then I hit page break. So now I'm on a new chapter. And, the first chapter is FU. But then I got thinking, oh, well, who's saying this? And why and about what? I literally had no idea. All of a sudden, I'm writing in the voice of a 20-something Orange County woman, which clearly I'm not. But I'm having a great time doing it. And similarly to Bobby Z, I just felt like breaking all the rules. I was so tired of hearing them. I was so tired of hearing that I had no brand, that people didn't know where on the shelves to put me. I was so tired of the blogosphere, the internet's endless definitions of what a crime novel should be, and the endless slivering. Is it hard-boiled? Is it soft-boiled? Is it a procedural? Is it a thriller? If it's a thriller, your character has to be in jeopardy on page 1. Hell, in Frankie Machine, nothing happens till page 67. Fixing his wife's leaky faucet, right? Because I thought, screw it. Who made these rules? Who came down from the mountain with these tablets? That we're expected to obey, and if we don't, they don't want to put us on, certain shelves. F you. And then I'm just typing away. Listen, I made Savages up as I went along, but I'll tell you what, I wrote the first 14 pages, and then I sent it to my buddy who was becoming my agent, Shane Salerno, who's, famous A-list screenwriter in his own right. And I emailed him the first 14 pages. And I said, either this is really good or I've lost my mind completely. And like 20 minutes later, he writes back and says, drop everything else you're doing and finish this. And so I did. But I made it up as I went along.
What's the difference for you writing from a male point of view as, say, Ben or John versus that of Ophelia, affectionately known as O throughout the novel and film?
Listen, I knew her, right? I knew 20 of her, right? From having lived in Laguna, Dana Point for years. And, they were always around. I'll tell you a quick funny story, and then I will answer your question. There was a reporter from New York, young woman, who wanted to do a story, but she rang up and she said, I don't believe those characters really exist. I said, okay, fair enough. Fly out here, go to John Wayne Airport, meet me at this bar in Laguna Beach. And if I can't show you all 3 of those main characters, Ben, Sean, and O, in 20 minutes, you win. She flies out. I meet her at a bar in the PCH in Laguna Beach, and we cross the street, literally cross the road to the volleyball courts there. And her eyes get like, boom. And she goes, there's O. Oh, there's, yeah. Now what do we do with the rest of the day? So I knew those people. And and then again, I mean, I think that, you know, people could have a quarrel with me, like, what's this middle-aged guy doing writing from a female's voice? But I've never believed, you know, that that's a problem, because if you follow the logic of that, all I should be able to write about is a middle-aged white guy writing books about a guy writing books. And I'm not going to write that, and you're not going to read it, right? You know, so it was really fun to get out and have fun with that language. I think my personal opinion is that more than anything, Savage is a book about language. And to take that very specific SoCal, South Orange County language and rhythms and just play with it, and flip between comedy and horror, you know, sometimes within a second. You know, somebody once said to me, you know, you switched points of view inside of a sentence. And I said, yeah, and if I can figure out how to do it inside of a word, I'm going to do it.
What was it like to then co-write your own script with Avatar writer Shane Salerno, also your agent, and the great Oliver Stone, scriptwriter of Scarface, Platoon, and so many other classics? Were you a fan of his films before working together on this adaptation of The Savages?
Shane and I wrote it, you know, and Oliver contributed to that as well. Yeah, well, you know, Shane's an amazing freaking agent. Very, very aggressive, very smart, knows the business inside and out. And he said, we can't sell this to someone to put it into development. Where you are in your career, we need a movie made. It came together amazingly fast. It was less than a year. Yeah, right? And they were shooting. And so I get the word, you know, Oliver wants to do this movie. And so I drove up to LA and met Oliver at his office, and we went out to dinner and talked it through. And, you know, Shane and I did the script, and bam, it's up and running. You know, it was on the fast track. It was amazing. When I started to write the drug books, I deliberately avoided, and still have avoided, any of the great drug films or television shows, because I did not want to be influenced by anybody else's take. With utter respect for all those other films, by the way, which I understand are wonderful, right? Traffic and, you know, all of them. Never seen a moment of any of them, never seen Narcos, never seen anything like that, because I just very deliberately I'm just going to do my own take based on my own research. If, you know, I'm sure there are going to be parallels because we're drawing largely from the same realistic material, I'm sure of all of that stuff. So when it comes time to write a screenplay for Savages, I'd written a screenplay before, right? But I loved a lot of the dialogue in Savages, you know, and so it was fairly, you know, it was fun to write, and, you know, we had a good time with it.
You then actually wrapped the series up with a prequel, The Kings of Cool, heading back in time to the 1960s this time. And for fans and viewers who don't know, is it harder to write a sequel when it's a prequel?
No, it was harder. It was considerably more difficult than Savages. Again, because, I don't know, maybe this is a mistake on my part. I get hung up on history. And I very much wanted to tell what was a real history. I could take you to the exact spot where the hippies and the surfers met and created the marijuana culture in Laguna Beach. Happened at an exact moment outside of a fast food restaurant, as described in the novel. You know, so I want to do a prequel, but I want to tell that story because I thought it was an interesting, cool story. I love subcultures, you know, and to sort of go into that moment of time, which I would love to have been at, but I was too young to have been at, it was really cool to me, you know, but it was harder because you know, Savages was just free form, right? Just write whatever the hell I feel like. When I got to Kings, I was trying to tell that story using fictional characters. And so it was harder to fit together.
We meet Denny Malone, the king of the Manhattan North at the top of the force, which Rolling Stone magazine correctly described as a page-turner that also manages to dive into deep issues. adding importantly that what truly sets Winslow apart, aside from his gut punch prose and deep understanding of the criminal worlds he inhabits, is his ability to perceive the greater truth behind the guns and drugs and death. USA Today tacked on their observation of another trait common to all your work, where a poignant nonfiction baseline threads throughout this novel, leaving readers to wonder how much of it is tragically true. And you've given a masterclass in this time and again in book after book. What first intrigued you about the real NYPD to lay the foundations for you to build this gritty world around that we live in throughout the force?
And I've written a number of different genre kind of books, but I never wrote the cop book. So one morning, 7:30 in the morning, Shane calls up. It's unusual. He's usually later in the day. And he says, well, what are we going to do next? And I said, I don't know. He said, what about a big New York cop book? And I said, oh, I could write the shit out of that. That's what we did. I said that with utter confidence. I was not confident. And I think it took me so long in my career because when you write New York, it's a home run or a strikeout. You know what I mean? There's nothing in between. You cannot hit a bloop single when you take on NYPD. Also, I was also aware that I was coming in the footsteps of some gigantic books and films. But one of the reasons that I wanted to do the book was to pay homage to them, because in many ways, those books and movies were responsible for me wanting to become a crime fiction writer. Remember to this day, the first time I saw Serpico. It was R-rated, and I managed to get into a theater in, Times Square, where later I worked. And I was so blown away. French Connection. Oh my God. Remember coming out of French Connection as a kid, thinking, man, if I could tell stories that way, that would be a great way to spend a life, wouldn't it? I mean, French Connection blew me out. Prince of the City. Right. And later I got to know Bob Lucy, who was the actual cop, the Prince of the City, became friends. And so I knew that if I wrote this book, I was following in their footsteps. I wanted to acknowledge them as inspirations, and so it got heavy, but fascinating to do, endlessly fascinating to research, spending time with those guys and being out on the streets and all of that.
How important is it, in your learned opinion, for a crime fiction author who's going to be portraying cops on the page to get the research as right as possible, from ride-alongs to anything else that puts you in their shoes?
Yeah, if you can, if you can, you can't always, and I can't blame writers who can't get into that situation and say, no, you shouldn't do it. I would never say that. But yeah, enormously useful. The stories I heard, I don't know how long it is. It's at least 30 pages in that book that the editor kept taking out and I kept putting back in, because it broke all the rules. It stopped the book. But there's a scene where 5 of these cops go out to dinner with a younger cop and they start telling stories. Nothing happens. They're just sitting at dinner telling these stories, which were stories that cops told me. And they were all true stories. And I just thought the stories were so great, and the editor would yank it out like, the plot stops and go, yeah, I know the plot stops, but the character keeps moving. And I think people are going to enjoy the story. And I also think I put it where I put it because I wanted the reader to have a breathing spell, because I knew what was coming up, right? I knew I was going to kick the ball down the stairs and it was going to be fast and tough and brutal and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, give the reader a breathing spell, right, before we move on. So if I hadn't been out in the field with those guys, if I hadn't spent the time going to the bars and going to dinners and in their homes, I would never have heard those stories.
What a great piece of advice. And while I've got your mind to mine from for a moment, do you prefer to know your ending ahead of time or be surprised as you're writing?
I like to be surprised. Look, I mean, with the big drug books, I'm pretty much following history. And so I have a pretty decent sense where we're going. So that's kind of the exception. But no, I don't outline. I make it up as I go along. Because I think if I'm surprised, the reader will be surprised, and that's a good thing.
Now you're really going out in a blaze of glory with the City on Fire series, taking all that amazing experience and expertise you've learned and earned to kick off this final trilogy before you officially announce your retirement from noveling to focus full-time on film and TV adaptations. And boy, are you taking readers out on a high note. Career-long fan of the LA Times would begin singing the praises of your swan song with the following comparison: that as he did in the Cartel trilogy, Winslow adeptly manages the comings and goings of a large cast of characters. By the end of this well-crafted, troubling epic, enough people are left standing to offer hope of a future for these deeply flawed families. That, plus a hint that Danny Ryan is heading to a warmer shore, should lure readers to the next installment of what's shaping up as Winslow's juggernaut of a modern-day epic. Where did this final masterpiece begin in concept? And what was most exciting about where your epic imagination took you on the page this final time?
I was 42, 43 before I read the classics. I knew Shakespeare and I knew African history. That was about it. And crime fiction, encyclopedic knowledge of crime fiction, of course. So I started reading the classics, and early on in that process, I hit the Iliad and the Aeneid, and I already knew those stories. Those were real life crime stories from growing up in Rhode Island and New York. The Iliad, come on, two big gangs facing off for each other. I knew these stories, man. So then I thought, and it's not an original idea, it's been done before. And, most famously, of course, by James Joyce and Ulysses. But I thought, could I take those classics and create a contemporary crime series that would stand on its own? That you could read them with no reference to the classics at all, and they're still cool crime stories. Or if you knew the classics, you'd go, oh, wow, shit, this is the Iliad. That's Aphrodite. There's, this guy, there's that guy. So I thought, okay, well, who would the character be? And I hit on Aeneas because he's a minor player in the Iliad. But then he goes on to found an empire and have these great adventures and all of this internal conflict and stuff. And so the more I read that, and the more I read the Greek tragedies, you take some of those Greek tragedies and you film them in black and white and put a trumpet behind them. You've got a noir movie. It's already there, And so that was always exciting, but it took me decades and decades because I was doing other things. And also, I doubted my own ability to do it. I think that's why it took me, again, decades to write the New York novel, because I didn't think I had the talent yet to do it, Same with this series. I wrote the first sentence of that damn book 27 years ago. And the first sentence hasn't changed since then, by the way. But I'd write it and I'd go, oh no, this sucks, and I'd set it down and I'd, do something else. I'd pick it back up and I go and write it and go, yeah, and then finally I think I had the confidence to see it through.
So as Danny Ryan transitions from City of Fire to City of Dreams and finally wraps his saga up in the forthcoming City of Ruins, he does so traveling with readers from East Coast to West, first to Hollywood in the second book, and then finally to Las Vegas, which must have presented you with all manner of sin to turn into a playground in your head. Please take viewers on a little road trip through why each of these stops along his trek were necessary ones for the story to make during and as it was wrapping up.
Place and character are inseparable for me. Place really is a character, particularly in that first book, because he's so Rhode Island. Grew up where I grew up, right? The beach where that book starts, because I lived there half the year and in Cali the other half the year. I'm there every day. And, I was there for the time I was 4 years old. I know every wave and ripple and, and so writing Rhode Island was great fun because it was a homecoming, that I thought would never happen. And I wasn't sure that I'd be accepted going home, because I left, right? The great sin of a parochial New Englander is to leave. Book 2 is mostly Hollywood, San Diego and Hollywood, which is, you can't have more fun than that. I knew Hollywood, from having had movies not made and having a couple made. And I'd been on a number of sets. So I knew the terrain and I knew San Diego. And so, I've got Danny living in a trailer park on, Capistrano Beach that I've, been to 1,000 times. And it's fun to do that. Then book 3, the guy needs to found Rome. Where's that going to be? Well, the only place it could be is Las Vegas. It's the only place left to build an empire that's a fantasy, that's a dream, because you can build freaking anything in Las Vegas. Nothing's real. But it required time to be in Las Vegas and, walk around and talk to people and, and get that whole sense of very close connections with the Las Vegas police. In all honesty, it's probably not where I'd choose to spend a lot of time. I don't drink and I don't gamble, and I'm very happily and faithfully married. So there's not a lot for me to do in Las Vegas. Las Vegas, I have to walk around and talk to people and, and get the sense of it. Unlike the drug trilogy, I knew this was going to be a trilogy. And I knew it had to be 3 separate books because, again, it needed a gasping spell between the 3 phases, right? That I wanted to give the reader a year away before we came back and go, okay, here's where the cat is now. Look, you meet Danny, he's a 20-something, right? And he's unhappy. And he's trying to fit in somewhere and trying to belong, but he has this sense there's something better out there. But in book 1, he never gets to it. It's forced on him. He loses a war, right? He has to leave. Like Aeneas, who fled Troy, the flames of Troy, with his elderly father as an infant son, leaving behind a dying wife, by the way. And then the top part of that arc is he wanders, trying to find a place to put his feet in this world. And man, did I know that feeling. Right? I left Rhode Island when I was 17 because there was nothing there for me. And then I spent, the next number of decades trying to have some success as a writer, trying to find a place to set my feet. And so I was pretty familiar with Danny's journey, although in all candor, that didn't occur to me until after I'd finished the books. If you'd asked me that 2 or 3 years ago, I'd have said no. So I love locations, it's funny, I rediscovered my home in Rhode Island in writing this book. We went back really to help take care of my mom, who was in her final years and needed that. So my wife and I started spending more and more time, in this little town in Rhode Island. And that came to, its inevitable conclusion, but I fell in love with the place again.
Sounds like quite a full circle moment to reach personally and professionally, especially knowing going in it was going to be your final set of books to write.
Absolutely was. Absolutely was. When I left, the town I grew up in was down and out. The factories had gone south prior to going to Mexico and China. The fishing was playing out. You couldn't necessarily be a fisherman even if you wanted to be. So a lot of my classmates were. 3 of my classmates, died out there in those waters. And so I took off to Nebraska to go to journalism school and see something else and try to build a life. And then I come back. Yeah, we always visited, I was back a lot, but coming back more seriously in my 60s and now thinking about writing this book, it was different, man. It was a trip, it was an experience. I've retired from writing novels. I took off to Nebraska to go to journalism school and see something else and try to build a life. And then I come back. Yeah, we always visited, I was back a lot, but coming back more seriously in my 60s and now thinking about writing this book, it was different, man. It was a trip, it was an experience. But all these 3 books are done. They're edited, they're just waiting, they're on the tarmac waiting to take off, to mix metaphors.
Turning back to your considerable goings-on in Tinseltown, the Washington Post would spotlight The Force as Don Winslow's summer blockbuster that is ready-made for Hollywood, a big fat book of fast-moving action that was both riveting and scary. in a lot of ways, and Deadline confirmed that it was heading for the big screen when they reported that Matt Damon is attached to the adaptation of the bestseller The Force, which James Mangold has been developing to direct for 20th Century Studios. And along with everything else you've got going on in that world, it must never get old seeing your wholly original characters and stories brought to life so cinematically through all these film and TV adaptations for so many new generations.
Still, I mean, they're as we speak. In fact, just before I was talking with you, I was watching dailies of because FX is doing the 3 drug books, and so I'm sitting here a half hour ago or watching words that I wrote in 1998 and 1999 from Power of the Dog. You know, with people and settings, and it's a bizarre feeling. I'll tell you what, though, for me is the coolest part of getting one of these things made, and I didn't realize it until Savages, and you'd think you would, it's fairly obvious. Sitting watching the credits, and I stayed till the very end, and I realized how cool it was that literally hundreds of people were working. That one morning you're sitting in your office and type out, F you, right? And then 2 years later, people are paying rents and mortgages and tuitions and car payments and all of that out of that moment. That's really the coolest part, man.
Finally, with this incredible opportunity for reflection, not simply because you've lived a true writer's life, with all its ups and downs, with all the territory that you braved into on the page, many argue you showed it to readers and a point of view they might not have otherwise wanted to see it through. What's been most important for you to hear from readers that you got it right time and again over the years?
That's been one of the best parts of it. Look, I've had hostile reactions and threatening reactions and all that, but for the most part, no. I talked to a lot of cops. A cop one time called me up and said, you're just the liberal asshole I thought you probably were. It's a chief of police in a city I can't mention. He said, but I think you've got some good ideas. Could we talk about how you put a treatment center in a jail? I said, sure, but I'm not an expert, but here are people who are. Let me put you in touch. I've never been, when I was on the road for any of the drug books, never once was I at one of those events where someone did not come up to me afterward to talk about a relative who died or been killed or a loved one. Did I know anything about it? That was kind of heartbreaking in some ways, but yet it meant something. Same with cops. Of course I got some hostile reactions from cops, but for the most part, it was, yeah, you get us, thank you, for writing that. So all of that's been, enormously satisfying. The other day, I was laying on the couch in my other office. We rent an old gas station out on the road here, and that's where I usually work. It's where I am right now, but I have a little office in the house. It's a minute walk from here. And I was laying on the sofa with my laptop, rewatching The Wire streaming. And I look up and my bookshelf is behind that. I'm gonna get emotional. I looked up at this bookshelf, which is all the books in order. I thought, wow, okay. You did a little something,
Mr. Winslow, it's been an honor speaking today, and as a fan of your catalog and career, I for one can say that you will be missed. Thank you so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Great. This has been a fun conversation. I've had a really good time.